A Streetcar Named Desire summary. A play about desire, violence, and the price of illusion. A Streetcar Named Desire, Tennessee Williams, 1947, is a modern tragedy disguised as a cramped apartment drama. It starts with an arrival that looks ordinary. A woman steps off public transit and asks for directions. Within hours, that arrival turns into a siege. This A Streetcar Named Desire summary explains how Blanche DuBois tries to rebuild her life by moving in with her younger sister, Stella, in New Orleans. Blanche brings stories, manners, and a desperate hunger for kindness. Stella's husband, Stanley, brings a different kind of truth, blunt, suspicious, and physical. The central tension is simple and brutal. Blanche needs protection and a clean start. Stanley needs control of his home, and the right to define what is real inside it. Stella is trapped between them, because love can be a shelter and a trap at the same time. The story turns on whether Blanche can survive the collision between her illusions and Stanley's power. Key points: A Streetcar Named Desire summary. The play follows Blanche DuBois as she moves into Stella and Stanley Kowalski's small New Orleans apartment after losing the family estate. Blanche tries to secure safety through charm, romance, and reinvention, but Stanley treats her as an intruder and investigates her past. A fragile courtship with Mitch offers Blanche a possible exit, until Stanley destroys it by exposing what Blanche has been hiding. Stella's loyalty becomes the play's quiet battlefield. Stella must choose what to believe in order to keep living with Stanley. The apartment's closeness turns everyday conflict into pressure cooker intimacy, where privacy disappears and cruelty becomes entertainment. Williams uses music, light, and memory to show how trauma warps time and perception, especially for Blanche. The play's title is a map of fate. Desire drives choices, and those choices carry consequences that no one can fully control. Full plot. Here is the full plot summary with spoilers. Act 1, Setup and Inciting Incident. Blanche DuBois, Stella's older sister, arriving with nowhere left to go, reaches Elysian Fields in New Orleans after taking a streetcar named Desire, transferring to one called Cemeteries, and getting off near a place called Elysian Fields. The route sounds like local transit, but it also reads like a warning, desire, death, and an afterlife of consequences. Blanche arrives overdressed, shaken, and already drinking, as if the heat and the world are both attacking her. Stella Kowalski, Blanche's younger sister, trying to keep her marriage stable, is thrilled and alarmed at once. Blanche quickly explains the crisis. Belle Reve, the family home, is gone. Blanche frames the loss as a chain of deaths, debts, and exhaustion, with Blanche left to manage the dying and the paperwork. Blanche also carries anger at Stella for leaving home and abandoning Blanche to handle the collapse alone. The sisters love each other, but the reunion is not pure comfort. It is grief mixed with blame. Stanley Kowalski, Stella's husband, defending his territory, enters with the energy of a man who assumes the room belongs to him. Stanley is not polite in Blanche's style, but Stanley is not timid either. Stanley clocks Blanche's performance immediately. The refined voice, the delicate gestures, the sudden faintness when questions get close. Blanche reads Stanley as vulgar and dangerous. Stanley reads Blanche as a liar who thinks class gives Blanche immunity. The first real conflict is practical and legal. Stanley invokes the Napoleonic Code, meaning the Louisiana principle that a husband can claim rights in a wife's property and inheritance. Stanley suspects Blanche has sold Belle Reve and pocketed money that should partly belong to Stella and therefore to Stanley. Blanche insists there is no hidden cash, only loss. Stanley demands proof. Blanche responds with contempt. The power struggle locks in. Stanley will not let Blanche control the story of Belle Reve, and Blanche will not let Stanley define Blanche as a thief. Life in the apartment makes every tension louder. The space is small, the walls feel thin, and the neighborhood is alive with voices, music, and heat. Blanche tries to create a private world anyway. Blanche takes long baths, changes clothes like armor, and drinks in secret. Blanche flirts with strangers for reassurance, as if attention can substitute for safety. The pressure spikes during a poker night. Stanley invites friends over, including Mitch, Stanley's friend, lonely and yearning for decency, and Steve, a neighbor and poker buddy, hard-edged in his own way. The apartment fills with smoke, sweat, alcohol, and male noise. Blanche tries to keep dignity by acting like the men are beneath Blanche's notice, but Blanche is also drawn to Mitch's awkward kindness. Mitch stands apart from the others, and Blanche senses an opportunity, a man who might offer marriage, stability, and escape. Stanley's temper erupts when Stanley feels challenged. Stanley drinks, loses control, and hits Stella during the poker night. Stella flees upstairs to Eunice, the neighbor, practical and protective, and Stanley bellows Stella's name in the street with raw need. The moment is ugly and intimate. Stella returns to Stanley anyway. Blanche witnesses this cycle and is horrified. But Blanche also learns a crucial fact. Stella's loyalty is not governed by reason alone. Desire, dependence, and habit have fused Stella to Stanley. Blanche and Mitch connect in the aftermath. Blanche asks Mitch to cover the bare light bulb with a paper lantern, because Blanche cannot stand harsh light. On the surface, it is a mood choice. Underneath, it is a credo. Blanche needs soft edges to survive. Mitch plays along, and their tenderness becomes a counterpoint to Stanley's brutality. What changes here is that Blanche stops being a visitor and becomes a threat to Stanley's home, while Stella proves that love can override violence. Act 2. Escalation and midpoint shift. Blanche's strategy becomes clear. Blanche will stay long enough to secure a respectable future, and Blanche will do it through performance. Blanche dresses up for outings with Mitch. Blanche talks about old Southern gentility and proper romance. Blanche avoids bright light and direct questions. Blanche aims to turn need into charm and shame into mystery. Stanley's strategy is the opposite. Stanley will strip the performance until only facts remain, and Stanley will use those facts like weapons. Stanley begins asking around about Blanche's reputation back in Laurel, Mississippi. Stanley gets information through a man named Shaw, someone who travels through Blanche's hometown and knows what people say. Stanley does not treat gossip as uncertain. Stanley treats gossip as evidence that Blanche deserves whatever happens next. As Blanche and Mitch grow closer, Blanche tries to guide the relationship toward marriage. Blanche acts coy, but Blanche pushes for security. Blanche also sets conditions. Blanche resists being handled and insists on romance as a form of respect. Mitch wants intimacy, but Mitch also wants to believe Blanche is good, because Mitch is looking for a partner who will not shame Mitch's devotion to Mitch's sick mother and Mitch's simple values. Blanche's past keeps leaking through the cracks. Blanche drinks more than Blanche admits. Blanche is easily startled by sudden noises. Blanche reacts intensely to certain music. Blanche tells stories that do not always line up. Even Blanche's kindness can feel like manipulation, because it often arrives right before Blanche needs something. The play deepens Blanche's history through confession. Blanche reveals the wound that never closes, Blanche's young husband, Alan Gray. Blanche married Alan believing in romance, then discovered Alan's hidden life with another man. Later, during a night out at the Moon Lake Casino, Blanche confronted Alan with disgust. Alan fled and killed himself. Blanche describes hearing the Varsuviana, a polka, and hearing a gunshot that seems to break the music in Blanche's head. From that point, Blanche's desire for love is fused to terror and guilt. Blanche does not just want affection. Blanche wants absolution. This confession matters because it reframes Blanche's flirting and vanity. Blanche is not only shallow. Blanche is trying to outrun a moment Blanche cannot undo. Blanche treats kindness like oxygen, because Blanche has been suffocating for years. Stanley's investigation closes in. Stanley learns that Blanche stayed at the Flamingo Hotel, a place with a bad reputation, and that Blanche was asked to leave. Stanley also learns that Blanche lost Blanche's teaching job after an affair with a teenage student. Stanley collects these facts and waits for the moment they will do maximum damage. Stanley does not merely want Blanche gone. Stanley wants Blanche erased as a moral authority, so Blanche can never challenge Stanley again. The midpoint shift arrives when Blanche's exit plan starts to depend on Mitch, and Stanley moves to destroy that dependency. Blanche tries to present a refined self to Mitch, but the reality Stanley has gathered is not just embarrassing. It threatens Mitch's belief that Mitch is choosing a respectable wife. When Stanley shares the story with Mitch, Mitch's fantasy collapses. Now Blanche is not a fragile aristocrat in trouble. Now Blanche is, in Mitch's mind, a woman with a sexual past that Mitch feels entitled to punish. At the same time, Stanley tightens control over Stella. Stella is pregnant, close to giving birth, physically vulnerable, and emotionally invested in keeping a family together. Stanley argues that Blanche is lying and manipulating them. Stella resists, but Stella also wants peace. The closer Stella gets to labor, the more Stella needs the apartment to feel stable. That need becomes leverage Stanley can use. Pressure escalates through humiliation. On Blanche's birthday, Stella attempts a small celebration. Stanley arrives with the gift Stanley has chosen, a one-way bus ticket back to Laurel. The message is not subtle. Stanley is telling Blanche to leave, and Stanley is telling Stella that the decision is already made. The cruelty triggers a fight between Stella and Stanley that drives Stella into labor. Stanley takes Stella to the hospital. Blanche is left alone in the apartment, with nowhere to run. Mitch arrives after Stella leaves. Mitch confronts Blanche with what Stanley has told Mitch. Blanche tries to deny it, then shifts to partial confession. Blanche begs Mitch for understanding, arguing that Blanche's behavior came from loneliness and fear, not malice. Mitch rejects Blanche's attempt to control the narrative. Mitch also tries to force sex, framing it as payment for being deceived. Blanche fights Mitch off by threatening to scream fire, a threat that shows Blanche understands how quickly the neighborhood will respond to spectacle. After Mitch leaves, Blanche collapses deeper into fantasy. Blanche begins talking as if an old admirer will rescue Blanche. Blanche clings to the idea of a wealthy suitor who will restore Blanche's life. The fantasy is not random. It is a survival move. Blanche is building a story sturdy enough to stand in for reality, because reality is about to crush Blanche. What changes here is that Blanche loses the one realistic escape route, while Stanley gains the power to decide Blanche's fate inside that apartment. Act 3, Climax and Resolution. The endgame begins when Stanley returns from the hospital. Stanley is triumphant, Stella has given birth, and Stanley now has a child, a legacy, and a stronger claim to the future. Stanley finds Blanche alone, dressed up, drinking, and performing the role of a woman preparing for romance. Blanche tells Stanley that Mitch apologized and wanted forgiveness, and Blanche claims Blanche rejected Mitch. Blanche is trying to reclaim power through storytelling, but Stanley knows the facts and enjoys watching Blanche lie anyway. Stanley plays along briefly, pretending to indulge Blanche's fantasy, because Stanley wants Blanche relaxed enough to break. Then Stanley turns vicious. Stanley mocks Blanche's pretensions and exposes Blanche's inventions. Blanche panics and tries to defend Blanche's last piece of control, the right to choose what is real. Blanche grabs a broken bottle and threatens Stanley. Stanley overpowers Blanche. The play signals what happens next through atmosphere and sound, rather than explicit staging. Stanley rapes Blanche. The act is not only physical violence. It is Stanley's final argument. In Stanley's world, power decides truth. Blanche's voice and Blanche's version of events do not matter if Stanley can force Blanche into silence. Time shifts forward to the final scene. Weeks later, the apartment appears to have returned to routine. Stanley plays poker again with friends. Stella has a newborn baby. Eunice helps Stella pack Blanche's belongings. Blanche is in a bath, detached and unstable, as if washing could erase what happened. Stella faces the core choice of the play. Blanche has told Stella about the rape. Stella cannot fully accept it, because accepting it would destroy Stella's marriage and the life Stella has built. Stella chooses denial as a form of survival. Stella agrees to institutionalize Blanche, framing it as care, but the decision is also a removal of the problem Blanche represents. A doctor and a matron arrive to take Blanche away. Blanche initially resists, terrified, but the doctor treats Blanche gently. Blanche responds to gentleness because gentleness has become rare. Blanche goes with the doctor, speaking the line that lands like a final thesis. Blanche has always depended on the kindness of strangers. Mitch breaks down, unable to hold the weight of what has happened. Stanley remains in the apartment, and the poker game continues, almost uninterrupted. The external conflict resolves in Stanley's favor. Blanche is removed. Stella stays. Life continues in the same room, with the same routines, as if tragedy can be absorbed into wallpaper. Analysis and themes. Theme 1. Illusion versus reality. Claim: Blanche's illusions are not vanity, they are a survival system that collapses under sustained exposure. Evidence: Blanche covers the bare bulb with a lantern, avoids bright light, and reshapes facts about age, status, and motive. Blanche builds romantic stories to replace financial collapse and sexual shame. Stanley counters by demanding documents, spreading gossip, and forcing confrontations that strip away Blanche's narrative protection. So what? Many people use curated stories to function, especially after trauma. The play asks a hard question. When does a protective story become a lie that harms others? And when is it simply the scaffolding that keeps a person upright? Theme 2. Desire as a force that drives and destroys. Claim: desire in the play is both engine and trap, pushing characters toward what they want and toward what ruins them. Evidence: Blanche follows desire into flirtation, secrecy, and dependency on Mitch's approval. Stanley follows desire into possession, dominance, and the need to win the apartment as a kingdom. Stella follows desire back to Stanley after violence, choosing the body's pull over the mind's warnings. So what? The play treats desire as something that does not politely stop when consequences appear. That is why it feels modern. People still confuse wanting with deserving, and still mistake intensity for safety. Theme 3. Masculinity, power, and the politics of the home. Claim: Stanley treats the apartment as a state, and Stanley uses masculinity as the law that governs it. Evidence: Stanley demands Blanche's papers through the Napoleonic Code, asserts dominance during poker night, and frames Blanche as a threat to male order. Stanley recruits other men through story sharing, turning private shame into public judgment. The rape functions as the ultimate enforcement of control when argument and intimidation are not enough. So what? The play shows how power often hides inside normal domestic life. It also shows how communities enable it when they treat cruelty as just someone's personality rather than a system of coercion. Theme 4. Class collapse and a changing America. Claim: Blanche represents a decaying class identity, while Stanley represents a rising order that values force, work, and possession over pedigree. Evidence: Blanche clings to manners, French phrases, and old-world romance, even as Blanche admits Belle Rêve is gone. Stanley mocks the performance and insists on tangible proof, money, and ownership. Stella's marriage is the bridge between worlds, and the bridge is unstable because it depends on Stella surrendering parts of Stella's past. So what? The conflict is not only personal, it is historical. The play captures how a society can change faster than people can adapt, and how class shame can mutate into cruelty, denial, and self-invention. Theme 5. Sexual double standards and shame as social control. Claim: The play shows how sexual history becomes a weapon used to decide who deserves dignity. Evidence: Blanche's past relationships are treated as proof of moral unfitness, while Stanley's sexual aggression is normalized as male appetite. Mitch's disappointment turns into entitlement, as Mitch tries to claim sex as compensation. Blanche's reputation becomes a public verdict that overrides Blanche's pain and complexity. So what? Shame remains a mechanism of control, especially over women. The play exposes how quickly empathy vanishes when a person is labeled impure, and how morality can be used to justify violence. Theme 6. Trauma, memory, and the mind's last shelter. Claim: Blanche's breakdown is not sudden madness. It is the final stage of a long internal war. Evidence: Blanche is haunted by the Varsuviana and the gunshot memory of Alan Gray's death. Blanche's drinking and bathing read as ritual attempts to reset the body and silence the past. After the rape, Blanche's fantasies intensify because reality becomes unbearable. So what? The play refuses to present trauma as neat backstory. Trauma is a living force that changes perception, behavior, and risk. The tragedy is not simply that Blanche suffers. The tragedy is that Blanche's coping methods also make Blanche easier to dismiss. Character arcs. Protagonist: Blanche begins believing that style, romance, and careful concealment can earn Blanche safety. Blanche ends with those tools shattered, relying on gentleness from strangers rather than protection from family. The shift is forced by Stanley's investigation, Mitch's rejection, and the final act of violence that removes any possibility of Blanche negotiating reality on Blanche's terms. Stella's arc is quieter but central. Stella begins believing Stella can have love and stability without confronting what that love requires Stella to ignore. Stella ends by choosing denial, because acknowledging Blanche's truth would require Stella to rebuild Stella's entire life. Stella's choice is not framed as simple evil. It is framed as a human bargain with unbearable cost. Stanley's arc is a consolidation rather than a transformation. Stanley begins defending territory and ends owning it completely. The play's discomfort comes from how ordinary Stanley's victory feels within the world of the apartment. Structure. Williams divides the play into 11 scenes, and the structure feels like tightening knots rather than separate chapters. The apartment setting compresses everything. There is almost no physical escape, so conflict becomes intimate and constant. This compression makes every interruption feel violent, because privacy is never guaranteed. The play also uses expressionistic theater techniques to externalize Blanche's inner state. Music rises when memory surges. Light becomes a moral force. The lantern over the bulb is not just decoration, it is Blanche's shield against exposure. The neighborhood sounds keep reminding the audience that life continues outside the tragedy, indifferent and loud. Williams's pacing is ruthless. The plot is not a mystery about whether Blanche is hiding something. The plot is about how long a human being can survive once a hostile environment decides to strip away the last protections. What most summaries miss. Most summaries describe the story as Blanche versus Stanley, as if it is a duel. The deeper structure is Stella as the hinge. Blanche can lie, flirt, and plead, but Blanche's fate ultimately depends on whether Stella will defend Blanche when it becomes costly. Stanley knows that. That is why Stanley's campaign focuses on controlling Stella's belief, not just humiliating Blanche. Another overlooked element is that Blanche's illusion is not simply falsehood. Blanche often speaks in a way that is emotionally accurate, even when details are unstable. Blanche tells the truth of need, fear, and guilt, but Blanche cannot always tell the truth of dates and facts. The tragedy is that the world treats factual inconsistency as permission to deny emotional reality, including violence. Finally, the play is not only about the cruelty of men. It is about how a whole social environment absorbs cruelty and keeps moving. The poker game continuing at the end is not background. It is the point. Relevance today. Curated identity and public exposure. Blanche's self-invention resembles modern persona management, where people shape how they are seen to avoid judgment. When receipts arrive, the collapse can be social and psychological, not just reputational. Domestic violence and community enabling. The play maps how violence can be normalized inside relationships, and how friends and neighbors may intervene briefly, but ultimately step back when it's their business. Power inside private spaces. Workplaces have HR, streets have laws, homes often run on informal power. The play shows how control can hide behind routine, jokes, and the idea that a man's temper is just part of him. Sexual history as a moral courtroom. The logic that a person's past intimacy determines what harm they deserve still appears in gossip cultures, online pile-ons, and even legal and media narratives around assault. Mental health and institutional solutions. The removal of Blanche through medical authority raises questions that still matter about who gets labeled unstable, who gets believed, and whether care is sometimes used to restore social comfort rather than heal a person. Masculinity backlash and status anxiety. Stanley's need to win reads like a model of status threat, where domination becomes proof of worth. That dynamic fuels everything from relationship coercion to political rhetoric about real men and real authority. Inequality and precarious survival. Blanche arrives with no money, no stable job, and no safe housing. The play shows how quickly dignity erodes when a person is cornered by economics as much as by personal enemies. Ending explained. The final scene resolves the plot by restoring the apartment to normal through removal. Blanche is taken away and the household continues. That continuation is not comfort. It is indictment. The world does not end when someone is destroyed. The world keeps eating, playing cards, and calling it a night. The ending means the play's true villain is not only Stanley's brutality, but the system of denial that makes brutality survivable for everyone else. Stella cannot face what accepting Blanche's account would require, leaving Stanley, breaking the family, and raising a child in upheaval. So Stella chooses a reality that allows Stella to stay. Blanche's final dependence on the doctor's gentleness is the cruel irony. Blanche wanted love from family and legitimacy from marriage. Blanche leaves with a stranger's kindness because that is the only kindness left available. The poker game's continuation shows how easily a community can fold trauma into routine and call that resilience. Why it endures. A Streetcar Named Desire endures because it refuses easy sorting. Blanche is not a saint, and Stanley is not a cartoon. Stella is not simply weak, and Mitch is not simply good. Each person is understandable, and that is what makes the story frightening. This play is for readers who want character psychology with teeth, and for anyone interested in how power operates in private life. It is also for audiences who can handle discomfort, because the story does not protect the viewer from what people do to each other when desire becomes possession. Some readers will not enjoy it if they want clean moral comfort, or if they prefer tragedy that feels distant and historical. Williams makes the tragedy domestic, close, and ordinary, which can feel like being trapped in the room with the characters. In the end, the play leaves the central dilemma intact, whether a person can survive when the world demands truth in the harshest light, and the only way to breathe is to keep the lantern in place. More insight, less noise. Subscribe and explore the full range at taylortailored.co.uk.